Hi, I'm Christine Clyatt Brown. I'm a behavioral neurologist at the University of Utah, and I'm going to talk to you today about Alzheimer's disease. So we'll talk a bit about what is Alzheimer's disease, and then what does a typical disease course look like? How do patients generally present to us? What can they actually look like? And then what's the underlying pathology? If we were to look at the brain under a microscope, we'll go over brain imaging in Alzheimer's disease, and then we'll talk a bit about treatment. So Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia in the United States. It's a neurodegenerative disease where if we were to look under a microscope, we would see amyloid plaques, tau tangles, and neuronal damage. That means there's damage to the neurons in the brain. The most common earliest symptom is memory loss. This usually looks like trouble remembering conversations or remembering recent events. As the disease progresses, though, many other cognitive domains are impacted. Things like language, executive function, visuospatial function. So what does a typical disease course look like? In Alzheimer's disease, there's a long preclinical or prodromal stage where there are no symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. There's no cognitive impairment or evidence of impairment in functioning, but there is the presence of Alzheimer's disease pathology. So that if we were to look at the brain under a microscope, we would see those proteins, amyloid and tau. Or if we used special imaging to look for them, we would find them, even though this person has no symptoms. This can start even decades before someone develops symptoms. Then this often progresses to mild cognitive impairment. This is where someone has cognitive impairment, so they don't do quite as well as we would expect on cognitive testing, but they're still able to function independently. Then as the disease progresses, ultimately it often involves functional impairment, transitioning into the stage we would call dementia, where there's progressive cognitive decline with symptoms that are now to the point that it's impacting their ability to function totally independently. And then we can divide that up further into mild, moderate, or severe. There are several different staging symptoms, but generally mild, moderate, severe is based mostly on how someone is functioning. So that if they have mild functional impairment, but they're able to do most things on their own, maybe they just need a little help with finances, for example, we would call that mild dementia. If someone is starting to need increasing help, maybe now they can't cook, now they can't manage their medications, they're needing a little more supervision, then we're starting to call it moderate. And then when you get to the severe stage, these are people who have more impairment in the basic activities of daily living, like feeding, bathing, dressing, that sort of stuff. So there are several different variants of Alzheimer's disease. It doesn't always look the same. So Alzheimer's disease can present differently depending on what parts of the brain are most affected in that person. So I mentioned that memory is most commonly the first affected thing. This we would call a typical amnestic presentation of Alzheimer's disease, where memory is the first and most prominent symptom, but it generally does impact at least one other domain and then will progressively worsen. So this is the most common, the classic sort of presentation of Alzheimer's disease. However, sometimes it starts a little differently. In logopenic primary progressive aphasia, language is the first and most severely affected domain, and memory is actually spared early on. So sometimes people will have this primary progressive aphasia form of Alzheimer's disease, where they have a lot of trouble with word finding difficulty, and even when you look at things like their memory, their executive function, everything else is outshined by the language impairment, which is the most disabling feature in this variant of Alzheimer's disease. Then there's dysexecutive Alzheimer's disease. As you may guess from the name, in this one, executive function is the first and most severely affected domain. And again, memory is spared early on in dysexecutive Alzheimer's disease. We see this one a little more commonly in people with the onset of Alzheimer's disease earlier in life, before age 65. And then there's something called PCA, or posterior cortical atrophy. This happens when Alzheimer's disease disproportionately affects the back part of the brain, the parietal and occipital lobes. This looks like early and prominent impairment in visuospatial and perceptual information. So eventually, as this disease progresses, these people with PCA can get something called cortical blindness, where they really can't interpret any visual information about their environment. They can't recognize things from pictures. They can't read. Another common feature in PCA is something called apraxia, where you can't perform planned motor movements. So that might look like not being able to figure out how to use a tool like a hammer, or not understanding how to use things like a fork and a knife. There's even something called a dressing apraxia, which is common in PCA, where people can't figure out how to put their clothes on correctly. And again, in PCA, memory is spared early on. Then there's something called behavioral variant AD as well. This is where Alzheimer's disease causes pretty early and prominent changes in behavior, sometimes mimicking something called behavioral variant FTD, a similar sort of pattern of impairment where the main problem is behavior, but the underlying cause is frontotemporal dementia rather than Alzheimer's disease. So when we look at the brain under a microscope of people who have Alzheimer's disease, we see amyloid and tau. So you can see in these kind of orangey brown, fluffy sort of things. This is all amyloid. These are amyloid plaques. They're outside of the brain cells. And we see this fibrillar masked amyloid beta protein. The next thing we see is tau tangles. So here you can kind of see the shape of a neuron. These are intracellular aggregations of misfolded tau protein. You see more of these over here and over here as well. And then the other thing we see is neurodegeneration. There's loss of neurons and loss of the synapses, the connections between different neurons. So when we look at the brain imaging, oftentimes the first thing we start with is a brain MRI. That gives us a really good look at the structure of the brain. In Alzheimer's disease, a very common early feature is medial temporal atrophy, specifically including the hippocampus. So these are the temporal lobes down here. And if you look, this lump here and this lump here, those are the hippocampus, the hippocampi. And this one on the right side of the brain looks pretty shrunken compared to the one on the left. And so that's hippocampal atrophy. You can generally see that this middle part of the temporal lobe on the right side just looks really shrunken compared to the one on the left side. Another thing we see as the disease progresses is atrophy in other parts of the brain, the other parts of the temporal lobes and the parietal lobes as well. You can also get atrophy in the frontal lobes. This atrophy can be symmetric or it can be asymmetric. And the pattern of atrophy we see can vary according to the Alzheimer's disease variant. For example, in posterior cortical atrophy, or PCA, we see asymmetric atrophy, specifically of the occipital and parietal lobes. Another type of imaging I commonly get in trying to evaluate for the underlying cause of someone's dementia is an FDG PET scan. FDG stands for fluorodeoxyglucose. And so this is basically a labeled sugar, labeled glucose. So we look at how the brain takes up this labeled sugar, and this is a measure of the brain's metabolism. Then the pattern of low uptake that we see on these scans helps us to differentiate Alzheimer's disease from other neurodegenerative diseases like FTD or dementia with Lewy bodies. So in Alzheimer's disease, we may see a scan like this. So this scan shows the brain from different views, looking at it from the right side, the left side, the front, back, top, and bottom. And these two are if we were to cut the brain in half and look at the inner surface of the right and left sides of the brain. This is done using a special software program that compares someone's brain metabolism to age-matched norms. And then we put it through this software program and it shows us increasingly bright colors that correspond to lower than normal brain metabolism. So that things that are more this blue to green color are going to be mildly low metabolism. Areas of that are yellow are going to be moderately low metabolism, and then red is severely low metabolism. So in Alzheimer's disease, we usually see that the parietal hypometabolism is worse than the frontal hypometabolism. We also see this posterior and lateral temporal hypometabolism. So the kind of side and back part of the temporal lobe has really low metabolism. And then if we were to look at the back part of the brain, except in that variant PCA, then we see that it's relatively spared, that the occipital lobes look pretty normal. If we look at the middle part of the brain, we see involvement of areas called the precuneus and the posterior cingulate. These are just different features we can look at to help differentiate Alzheimer's disease from others. There's also something called an amyloid PET scan. Now, this one is not currently available clinically. It's primarily used for research purposes, but as there are emerging amyloid clearing medications, we may end up seeing more widespread clinical use of this type of scan. So an amyloid PET scan, instead of showing how the brain takes up glucose, we're instead using a special compound that binds to amyloid in the brain. And then we can see that on the brain imaging as these bright colors throughout the cortex. And if someone did not have amyloid where it doesn't belong, then we wouldn't see those bright colors. So then what do we do when it comes to treating Alzheimer's disease? So lifestyle is a really important thing for any kind of dementia. Things we recommend are things like the Mediterranean diet, regular aerobic exercise, and then being more engaged cognitively and socially. When it comes to medications, the kind of mainstay of treatment of Alzheimer's disease for quite some time has been something called donepezil or Aricept. This is a cholinesterase inhibitor that's indicated for use in dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. This medication doesn't stop or slow down what's going on in the brain, but it can help to mildly slow down decline on cognitive testing. Memantine is more of a symptomatic treatment. This is an NMDA receptor antagonist that's indicated for moderate or severe dementia due to Alzheimer's disease. And then a more recent development, we have these amyloid clearing therapies. There is lecanemab. This was recently approved by the FDA in January of 2023 under the FDA's accelerated approval pathway. This is an antibody that helps to clear amyloid from the brain. So this one actually does change what's happening in the brain. and it has been shown not only to remove amyloid, but also to slow down the decline on cognitive testing and the decline of functional impairment. So we don't see as much decline in daily functioning on lecanemab as we would in those who aren't on lecanemab. These amyloid clearing therapies come with significant risks, and right now, no amyloid clearing therapy has received traditional FDA approval, but lecanemab will be going up for that very soon. So by the time you hear this lecture, that may have changed. There are other emerging amyloid clearing agents like donanemab that are still in the works, and there's also research into tau clearing antibodies. So these are my references, and thank you for listening to my lecture on Alzheimer's disease.